The sun had just started to rise over the hills of Oklahoma when Evelyn Hart stepped out of the small wooden barracks that served as the infirmary. The air was crisp, cool, and still carried the faint scent of iron and damp soil. Beyond the fence line, she could see rows of men in gray uniforms lined up for their morning roll call. German prisoners of war, hundreds of them, held in a camp that looked ordinary on the outside but carried endless stories buried behind its barbed wires. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and tried to ignore the strange mixture of pity and unease that always came when she looked at them. She had been a nurse for 2 years, working with the Army Medical Corps, treating both wounded American soldiers and captured Germans. To her, they were all the same once they were lying on the table, their blood the same shade of red, their pain sounding no different in any language. Yet deep down she carried her own reasons for wanting to forget the faces of the enemy. Her older brother, Daniel, had gone missing in France a year ago. His letters stopped without warning. The telegram that followed said he was presumed dead. Evelyn never accepted it, but grief turned into a quiet numbness that clung to her every day she worked. Inside the infirmary, the day began like all the others. Rows of metal beds filled with men who coughed, groaned, or stared blankly at the ceiling. The smell of disinfectant mixed with sweat. Evelyn went about her duties, changing bandages, checking pulses, and whispering kind words in a language some didn't even understand. That morning, a group of new prisoners arrived under guard. One of them caught her attention immediately. He was young, maybe not older than 24, his uniform torn and stained with dirt, his face gaunt but his eyes alert. He limped slightly as he entered, refusing help from anyone. "Name," the doctor called out. "Lucas Weber," the young man answered, his English soft but clear. Evelyn wrote it down on the chart without thinking much of it, but something about his calm voice lingered in her mind. The doctor motioned for Lucas to sit while they inspected a bullet wound that had healed poorly. It ran across his shoulder and down his upper arm, scarred and infected. Evelyn stepped forward with gauze and antiseptic, and for the first time he looked directly at her. Their eyes met, and she saw something she hadn't expected, not pride, not hatred, but exhaustion, the kind that only someone who had seen too much could carry. "You were shot recently?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Near the river. 2 months ago." The doctor continued examining the wound, muttering about poor field treatment. Evelyn cleaned the cut carefully, her hand steady though her mind wasn't. When she accidentally brushed against his hand, Lucas flinched, then whispered, "Danke." She didn't reply. It was strange hearing gratitude in German. Later that day, when the infirmary grew quieter, Evelyn found herself glancing over at Lucas's bed. He didn't talk much, just sat staring out the small barred window, his fingers tracing something invisible in the air. When she passed by, he would nod politely but never speak unless she did first. Most of the other POWs were loud, restless, complaining about food or cold, but Lucas remained distant, like he existed somewhere between here and another world entirely. A week passed. His wound improved. Evelyn thought he would soon be sent back to the barracks, and she felt oddly unsettled by the thought. She had learned little about him except that he once studied engineering before the war and was drafted near Munich. He rarely spoke about the fighting. When she asked what he missed most, he answered simply, silence. One evening, as the camp lights dimmed, Evelyn sat at her desk writing a report when she heard a soft voice behind her. "You have a brother?" Lucas asked. She turned, startled. "How do you know that?" He pointed toward the photo pinned to the wall, a young man in uniform smiling beside her. "He was in France," she said quietly. "They say he never came back." Lucas's gaze softened. "France. I was there too." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them grew heavier. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. There was something in his tone, not guilt, but sorrow, the kind that carried 1,000 untold stories. That night she lay awake in her small quarters, thinking of his eyes. She told herself it was pity, nothing more. But deep down she knew it was something different, something she hadn't felt in a long time, the faint spark of understanding, even across the line that divided enemies. Days turned into weeks. Lucas's strength returned, but instead of being sent away, the doctor assigned him to help around the infirmary, cleaning floors and carrying supplies. It was unusual, but he followed orders without complaint. Evelyn found herself speaking to him more often, sometimes about small things, weather, music, the taste of real bread. He told her about his mother's garden back home, how it used to smell of rain and apples. She told him about Oklahoma summers and how the air shimmered above the fields. Their words were quiet, hidden among the ordinary sounds of the camp, but they grew like roots beneath the surface. One afternoon, while changing bandages, Lucas hesitated and said softly, "I knew a man named Daniel Hart. He was captured near Metz. American soldier." Evelyn froze. Her heart pounded. "What did you say?" He looked up at her with steady eyes. "He saved my life." She could barely breathe. "How?" Lucas's voice trembled. "Our unit ambushed an American patrol. I was hit. He found me bleeding and instead of finishing me, he dragged me behind cover. When his men pulled back, he left me with water. I never saw him again." Evelyn's hands shook as she stepped back. Her mind raced, clashing between hope and disbelief. "Are you sure it was him?" Lucas nodded. "He said his name. Daniel Hart." Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. For so long, she had imagined her brother dying alone in some muddy field, his body lost to the earth. But now she heard that he had shown mercy even in war, that his final act might have saved a life, the very man who now stood before her. She couldn't speak for a long time. Lucas lowered his gaze, guilt flickering in his expression. "I am sorry," he whispered. "If I could have brought him back, I would have." Evelyn turned away, her vision blurring. "You don't understand," she said softly. "You already did." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. That night, rain poured outside, striking the tin roof like distant gunfire. Lucas sat by the window, watching the drops slide down the glass. Evelyn entered quietly and stood beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, "My brother would have wanted me to forgive." He looked at her with surprise. "You already have." She smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just can't hate anymore." Outside, thunder rumbled, and somewhere far beyond the fences, the world continued turning. But inside that small infirmary, the war felt distant for the first time. Two people, enemies by name, bound by one man's mercy, sat in silence, not as nurse and prisoner, not as victor and captive, but as human beings learning to breathe again. That night marked the beginning of something neither of them could name yet, something fragile and dangerous but deeply real. And though neither dared to admit it, they both knew that what was forming between them could never survive outside those barbed wires. Still, they couldn't stop it from growing. The days after the storm felt slower, as if time itself had grown careful, afraid to move too fast. The air around the camp turned heavy with humidity, and the faint smell of wet soil lingered everywhere. Evelyn found herself looking forward to each morning more than she would admit. She told herself it was for her work, for the patients, but in truth it was for the quiet moments when she might see Lucas standing near the storeroom or carrying bandages down the hall, his sleeves rolled up, his gaze always calm, always steady. The routine between them grew natural, almost unspoken. He would sweep the floors, she would hand him supplies. They exchanged few words but their eyes met often, small glances that lasted a heartbeat too long. In those silences, something unexplainable began to take shape, trust, perhaps, or the fragile kind of understanding that people find only when they have both lost too much. Yet the camp was not a place where silence went unnoticed. There were guards who watched closely, men who believed kindness toward prisoners was weakness. Captain Reed, the camp's commanding officer, had been a soldier too long to forget the faces of his fallen friends. He trusted no German, not even the ones barely old enough to shave. Evelyn had seen the way his eyes narrowed whenever Lucas spoke too freely in English, and she had learned to be careful, to keep her tone neutral whenever others were nearby. One morning, as she cleaned a table, Captain Reed entered without warning. "Nurse Hart," he said curtly, "I hear you've been allowing that German boy to wander too close to the restricted area." She looked up sharply. "He's under orders to assist with cleaning, sir. I haven't broken protocol." Reed's jaw tightened. "Don't let sympathy blind you. They might look harmless, but they remember who they are. Don't forget who we are either." Evelyn nodded quietly, but as Reed left, she felt her pulse hammering in her throat. She turned and saw Lucas standing by the back doorway, his face pale. He had heard every word. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, as if ashamed of something that wasn't his fault. That night, the camp lights dimmed earlier than usual. A heavy stillness hung over the barracks, broken only by the distant hum of crickets. Evelyn stayed late at the infirmary, sorting medicine, trying to push away the unease that had settled inside her. When she finally turned to lock up, she saw a shadow near the window. Her hand tensed, ready to call for the guard, until she heard a quiet whisper. "Evelyn." It was Lucas. He stood outside the barred window, his face faintly lit by the lantern glow. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, stepping closer. "I know," he replied, his voice low, careful. "But I had to tell you something." She hesitated, glancing toward the door. "What is it?" He looked down, searching for the right words. "They plan to move some of us tomorrow. South, maybe Texas. They don't tell us much. But I heard your captain mention my name." Evelyn's stomach turned. "Why?" "I think he doesn't trust me," Lucas said quietly. "He saw us talking." She pressed a hand against the cold windowpane, her reflection overlapping his. "Then don't draw attention. Do what they say. Don't look at me when others are around." He nodded. "I understand. But if they send me away—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "Don't say that." For a moment neither spoke. The night air felt thick between them. Evelyn's hand remained on the glass, and Lucas lifted his own, matching it from the other side. The metal bars divided them, but the space between their palms was only a whisper wide. "I don't know why this happened," he said softly, "but I'm glad it did." Evelyn closed her eyes. "So am I." Then footsteps echoed outside, and Lucas disappeared into the dark as silently as he came. The next morning brought tension that everyone could feel. Guards moved briskly, orders were shouted more than spoken. Trucks rumbled near the gates, carrying supplies and possibly men. Evelyn's chest ached with every minute that passed. When she entered the infirmary, she found Lucas already there, sweeping the corner floor as though nothing had changed. But his eyes were different, sharper, watchful. "I heard," she whispered as she passed him a box of gauze. He nodded slightly. "They say by evening." Her heart sank. "Maybe it's only a rumor." "Maybe," he said, though his tone said otherwise. The hours dragged on. Every sound, the clang of boots, the rattle of keys, the distant bark of orders, made Evelyn's nerves fray further. By afternoon, Captain Reed entered the infirmary again, his tone cold. "Hart, finish with your patients quickly. The prisoner transfer begins at dusk. I want that German cleaned up and ready." Evelyn froze. Lucas said nothing, just lowered his gaze. After Reed left, she pretended to sort medicine to hide the trembling in her hands. Lucas approached slowly. "It's all right," he said quietly. "No, it isn't," she whispered fiercely. "They'll send you hundreds of miles away. I'll never know if you're alive." He hesitated, his expression torn between calm and something deeper. "Evelyn, listen. There's something I didn't tell you. I wrote your brother's name in my notebook. When I'm sent back home, if that ever happens, I'll find where he's buried. I'll bring flowers. I promise you." Her throat tightened. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said simply. "He saved my life. Maybe this is how I repay him." Evelyn's eyes filled before she could stop them. She turned away, pretending to reach for something on the shelf. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. That evening, the sky turned orange and gray. Trucks lined up near the gates, their engines grumbling like restless beasts. The prisoners were herded into small groups, each carrying their meager belongings. Evelyn stood at the infirmary window, gripping the windowsill until her knuckles turned white. When Lucas appeared in line, her heart nearly stopped. His hands were bound loosely in front of him, his face calm but pale. For a brief moment, as he passed the window, he turned his head, just enough to find her eyes. It was not a long look, not even a second, but in that moment everything was said. The gratitude, the sorrow, the impossible connection that had bloomed between two enemies who were never meant to meet. The truck doors closed with a heavy clang. Dust rose as the convoy began to move. Evelyn stayed by the window long after they disappeared beyond the hills. That night she didn't eat, didn't sleep. She sat by her desk staring at the empty bed Lucas once occupied. It still carried the faint scent of medicine and earth. On the table beside it lay a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were a few words written in neat, careful handwriting. "For every wound, there is someone who chooses to heal. Thank you for being that person. L.W." Evelyn pressed the paper to her chest and wept quietly until dawn. The days that followed passed in silence. The infirmary felt colder, emptier. The guard stopped talking about the transfer, and Captain Reed seemed satisfied, though Evelyn could no longer stand to look him in the eye. Every time she heard a truck engine in the distance, her heart raced, hoping it might bring news, though none ever came. She carried on with her work, but her movements were slower, her smile softer. The other nurses noticed the change but said nothing. War changed everyone differently, some grew harder, some quieter. Evelyn simply carried her grief more gently now, as though learning to live with it instead of against it. Sometimes, late at night, she would stand by the fence and look toward the horizon, where the road vanished into the dark. She imagined Lucas somewhere far away, maybe staring at another fence, maybe holding on to the same memory. She wondered if he thought of her too. And even though she would never know, that thought was enough to keep her heart from breaking completely. The winter of 1945 came like a slow whisper across the plains. The war in Europe was drawing to its end, though in Oklahoma, the news arrived only in fragments, carried through letters, rumors, and radio voices that crackled between static. The camp had changed too. Many prisoners were gone now, sent back to new camps or awaiting repatriation. The fences still stood, rusted and quiet, like scars that refused to fade. Evelyn moved through her days in silence. The infirmary was almost empty now, the long rows of beds stripped clean. She had written Lucas's name in her notebook, not as a record of a patient but as a reminder of something that felt too human to belong to war. Sometimes, she reread his letter, the one he left on his bed, the words still carrying warmth as if his hand had written them yesterday. Outside, the snow began to fall one morning, fine flakes drifting over the barracks like ash. Evelyn watched through the window, her fingers resting lightly on the glass. She thought of Germany then, the places Lucas had described, the small garden his mother had kept, the sound of rain against the windows of his childhood home. She imagined him there, free, walking again in a world that no longer needed fences. But war had its own way of haunting people. It was late February when the telegram arrived. Evelyn had grown used to seeing them on other people's desks, but never her own. Her hands trembled as she opened it, fearing another message of loss, but the words were simple and official. POW transport convoy intercepted in Kansas. Several escaped. Some possibly en route south. Remain alert. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Kansas was not far. It was foolish to think it could mean anything, and yet she couldn't stop the thought, could Lucas be one of them? That night, unable to sleep, Evelyn sat outside her quarters, wrapped in a coat, the snow crunching under her boots. The camp was quieter than ever, just the faint hum of wind through the wires. Somewhere a guard coughed, his lantern casting dull circles of light on the frozen ground. Evelyn stared at the gate and wondered what freedom might feel like after so many years of waiting, not just for peace, but for meaning. Then, faintly, she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the camp, soft footsteps approaching through the trees beyond the fence. Her breath caught. She stood slowly, listening. The guards hadn't noticed. The night was too still. Then she saw a shadow move between the bare trunks, hesitant, limping slightly. Her pulse quickened. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Lucas." The shadow froze. Then, from the darkness, a voice answered, hoarse but unmistakable. "Evelyn." She nearly fell forward. He stepped into the light, thinner, his clothes worn, his beard short and rough. His eyes, though, they were the same, calm and steady even under the trembling glow of the lantern. She rushed to the fence, her hands gripping the cold metal. How did you get here?" "I escaped 3 nights ago," he said softly. "The convoy broke down near the tracks. I ran when I saw the chance." "You could be shot if they find you," she whispered. "I know," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "But I had to come back." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Why?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded envelope, weathered and damp. "Your brother," he said. "You told me he was never found. But after the armistice near Metz, I went back. The field was quiet then. I found his dog tags near the riverbank. I thought, you should have them." Evelyn's tears came before she could stop them. Her hands trembled as she reached through the fence, and Lucas placed the cold metal tags in her palm. The letters were faded but still clear, Daniel Hart, U.S. Army. She pressed them to her lips, choking back a sob. "You risked your life for this." He smiled faintly. "He saved mine. I only returned what I owed." The wind blew harder, scattering flakes between them. Evelyn looked at him through the fence, her heart breaking and healing all at once. "You can't stay. If they catch you." "I know," he said gently. "But I needed to see you again. To say goodbye properly." She shook her head. "No. Don't say goodbye. Not like this." He reached through the wires, his fingers brushing hers. The cold metal bit at their skin, but neither pulled away. "Maybe one day," he said, "when all of this is forgotten, people like us won't need fences to talk through." "Maybe one day," she whispered. They stood there for what felt like hours, the world around them shrinking to the space between their hands. The camp lights flickered faintly in the distance, the guards still unaware. Time seemed to stop, as if mercy itself was holding its breath. At last, Lucas stepped back. "You must go inside," he said. "They'll notice soon." "I can help you," she insisted. "You can hide until morning. I'll find a way." He shook his head. "No. You've done enough. You gave me something no one else ever did, forgiveness." She bit her lip, tears spilling again. "Then promise me you'll live. Promise me you'll make it home." "I'll try," he said. "And if I do, I'll write to this camp. You'll know I made it." Evelyn nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "Goodbye, Lucas." He smiled, a quiet, weary smile that carried everything words could not. Goodbye, Evelyn." He turned and disappeared into the dark woods, his footsteps fading with the wind. Evelyn stood there long after he was gone, clutching her brother's tags, her breath clouding in the air. Somewhere, far beyond the fences, she imagined him walking under the same moonlight, free but uncertain, carrying their unspoken words with him. Days passed. The war in Europe ended. The prisoners began to leave one by one, some returning home to broken towns, others to rebuild lives that no longer fit them. The camp emptied until only a few remained. Evelyn stayed on for a while longer, though she knew her heart had already left with the last truck that rolled out through the gates. Months later, as summer returned, she received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, careful, slightly slanted. She opened it slowly, her breath trembling. "Dear Evelyn. I am home. The war is over. The garden still grows. I planted apple trees for my mother and one for your brother. I remember the sound of rain on your roof and the way you spoke his name. I hope you have peace now, as I do. You once said you couldn't hate anymore. Neither can I. Thank you for teaching me that. Lucas." Evelyn smiled through her tears, holding the letter to her heart. Outside, the field stretched endlessly beneath the soft light of dawn. The air smelled of soil and new life. She stepped outside and looked toward the horizon, the same direction he had vanished months ago. For the first time in years, the world felt wide open again. She whispered his name into the wind, not with sorrow, but with quiet gratitude. The war had taken much from her, her brother, her laughter, her certainty in what was right and wrong, but it had also given her one thing back, the belief that even in the darkest places, kindness could survive, even between enemies, even across a fence. And though they would never meet again, their story remained, not written in books or spoken aloud, but carried in the silent hearts of two souls who had found something rare in a world of ruin. Not victory. Not forgiveness. But understanding. And that was enough.